Regardless of the problem du jour, I'm frequently asked what we the people can do. Everyone seems to think all the answers are in Washington, D.C., but a look at the Constitution and some Supreme Court opinions will show that the answer to an out-of-control federal government is a lot closer to home than you may think. So we'll discuss that next on the Constitution Study.
There's one thing you have to know wherever you make your stand. Came from a long through line of everyday Americans.
Hello there, everyday Americans, and welcome to the Constitution Study, where we read and study the Constitution. We teach the rising generation to be free. I am so glad you could join me today. Now, as always, you can find out more at the website, constitutionstudy.com, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the video. But for now, let's get into this question of how do we reign in Washington, D.C.? John Jay said, every member of the state ought diligently to read and to study the Constitution of his country and teach the rising generation to be free. By knowing their rights, they will sooner perceive when they are violated and be the better prepared to defend and assert them. So let's start our investigation by reading some clauses from the Constitution. Article 6, Clause 2 reads, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary, notwithstanding." Now, we need to start by understanding that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Only the laws of the United States made pursuant to the Constitution are considered the supreme law of the land as well. And if only the laws of the United States made pursuant to the Constitution are the supreme law of the land, it makes sense that any law not made pursuant to the Constitution is not the supreme law of the land. I know this seems obvious, but I have to be sure we're all on the same page. Now, next, let's take a look at the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Now, if the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, then when it says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution belong to either the states or the people, well, that would supersede any law to the contrary. Well, for example, when Congress passes a law to regulate something that's not a power delegated to the United States, say, for example, health insurance, it's not the supreme law of the land, which raises the question, what do we do with a law that's not the supreme law of the land? Well, Alexander Hamilton told us in Federalist Papers number 78. There is no position which depends on clearer principle than that every act of a delegated authority, contrary to the tenor of the commission under which it is exercised, is void. No legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution, can be valid. To deny this would be to affirm that the deputy is greater than the principal, that the servant is above his master, that the representatives of the people are superior to the people themselves, that men acting by virtue of powers may do not only what their powers do not authorize, but what they forbid. Not only is a law contrary to the Constitution not the supreme law of the land, it cannot be valid. Remember, every government position is an authority delegated either by the Constitution that created it or legislation created under the authority of a Constitution. By the way, it's not just Alexander Hamilton, but the Supreme Court that says so. Chief Justice Marshall wrote in the opinion of the Supreme Court case Marbury v. Madison, "Certainly all those who have framed written constitutions contemplate them as forming the fundamental and paramount law of the nation, and consequently the theory of every such government must be that an act of the legislature repugnant to the Constitution is void." Even the Supreme Court recognizes that legislatures cannot make valid laws that violate the Constitution. So who is responsible for determining if a law violates the Constitution? Most people think it's the Supreme Court who determines if something is constitutional or not. While the judicial power does extend to cases in law and equity arising under the Constitution, the federal courts are creations of the Constitution, not its master. So who is ultimately responsible to keep the federal government within the powers delegated to it by the Constitution? Well, once again, from the Supreme Court, this time it's Chief Justice Roberts writing in the NFIB versus Sebelius case. In the typical case, we look to the states to defend their prerogatives by adopting the simple expedient of not yielding to federal blandishments when they do not want to embrace the federal policies as their own. The court expects the states to defend themselves. How? By not yielding to federal blandishments, attempts to coax them into compliance. If a law is not made pursuant to the Constitution, if it is not the supreme law of the land, then the states are not required to abide by it. This is the first big clue about how we can rein in an out-of-control federal government. Next, we find more about state sovereignty, again from the case NFIB versus Sibelius. The states are separate and independent sovereigns. Sometimes they have to act like it. The American people have forgotten, or maybe we spent too many generations not teaching the fact, that when we declared independence, we did not create a new country, but 13 of them. From the Declaration of Independence, that these united colonies are and ought to be free and independent states. It was the states that created the federal government when they ratified the Constitution. And as the 10th Amendment confirms, any power not delegated to the United States generally remains with the states. See, it's not only the right of the states to push back when Washington goes too far, but I would say it's their duty. And that is the second clue of how we rein in Washington, D.C. There is one more. There's also the question of separation of powers. No, not between the branches of governments, as we often hear, but between governments themselves. From the case Prince versus United States. The framers rejected the concept of a central government that would act upon and through the states, and instead designed a system in which state and federal governments would exercise concurrent authority over the people. The federal government's power would be augmented immeasurably and impermissibly if it were able to impress into its service, and at no cost to itself, the police officers of the 50 states. The idea that the federal government can order states around is antithetical to the union of sovereign states the framers of the Constitution created. Your sheriff is the chief law enforcement officer, the Clio of your county. They are elected by the people and therefore serve the people. As the court stated, we adhere to that principle today and conclude categorically, as we concluded categorically in New York, the federal government may not compel the states to enact or administer a federal regulatory program. The mandatory obligation imposed on Clios to perform background checks on prospective handgun purchases plainly runs afoul of that rule. The federal government cannot order the states or Clios to enact or administer a federal program. In other words, there are limitations to the powers of Washington, D.C. Now, couple that with an understanding of the limited and enumerated powers delegated to the United States, and we can put together a formula to finally rein in this out-of-control federal government. Putting all of these clues together, what can the American people do to regain control of the behemoth we call Washington, D.C.? Well, let's review the clues. First, the states need to remember that they are separate and independent sovereigns, not vassals of Washington, D.C. The states created the federal government to serve them, not the other way around. The states delegated to the federal government certain limited and enumerated powers, which means only the states have the legal authority to amend the Constitution to give them more. Second, the states need to defend themselves against government overreach. Today it seems when the federal government goes too far, all most states will do is sue in federal court. That's like asking the bully's sister to protect you. Sure, we may want the court's opinion, but that's all it is, an opinion. We need for states to learn to stand their ground against Washington, D.C. Yes, they've made it harder when they ratified the 16th and 17th Amendments, but that doesn't excuse those in our state governments who roll over every time a new edict comes out of Washington, D.C. And lastly, our sheriffs, the chief law enforcement officers, are bound by oath or affirmation to the Constitution of our states and the United States. They need to take up their responsibility to protect the rights of the people of their county. Now, hopefully, the solution to an out-of-control federal government has become obvious. We need to have strong county and local governments, especially sheriffs. We need to educate ourselves and our neighbors of the importance of our sheriffs. If your sheriff and their deputies will not protect your rights, then it's time to find a better sheriff. As people in neighboring counties place a premium on the fidelity to their oath of office of their local officials, well, they will naturally have an impact on their state governments. As more and more people are vetting their candidates for state offices based on how they fulfill their oaths of office, our states will not only change, but can regain the fortitude to stand up to Washington, D.C. Finally, as more and more states restore themselves to their position as parties to the compact that is the Constitution of the United States, Washington, D.C. will take care of itself. I'm not suggesting that this will be a quick or easy fix. But if you look really closely, you'll find you don't need to be dependent on others to live free. You may not be able to make your county, state, or federal government constitutionally sound all by yourself, but you can live as a free citizen, especially when you remember the words of Abraham Lincoln. The people are the rightful masters of both Congresses and courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert it. We are the masters of Congresses and courts, not to overturn the Constitution, but the men who pervert it. And ladies and gentlemen, there's a whole lot of perverting going on. See, we are not dependent on others unless we allow ourselves to be. We have to voluntarily give up our rights, our sovereignty, our authority to let others tell us how to live our lives. I know it's unique. We haven't been brought up this way. We've been brought up to be dependent on government to do certain things, thinking it was the master and we were the servant, but it's really the other way around. Again, I'm not saying we're going to snap our finger or elect the right person and suddenly Washington, D.C. will get better. It's that thinking that has helped made the mess that we are in. No. The answer to an out-of-control federal government is to minimize its impact on us today. And we do that with the sheriff and with our state officials. If our sheriff will protect us from illegal, unconstitutional, and invalid federal laws, well, then they have less impact on me, and I don't care so much about them. If our states, our governors, our state legislators are upholding their goal, their purpose to defend us against an out-of-control federal government, if they are standing against the usurpation of state powers or federal government acting beyond the powers delegated to it, well, then again, what Washington does is of little impact to me. And so of little impact to you. And that's what I want to get across with this message and what I'll be talking about as we come to Independence Day. We don't need to be so worried about Washington when Washington has less of an impact of our lives. Now, yes, we've made it harder. The states made it harder, but that doesn't mean we can't stand. It doesn't mean that we can't stand and make sure our sheriffs will protect us, make sure our state legislators will protect us, make sure our governor and the executive branch of our state will protect us, because then Washington kind of takes care of itself. When Washington can't bully the states into doing its job for it, the bully loses its power. Now, hopefully you found this uplifting. There is an answer. It's not in the voting booth. Well, sort of. Yes, we want to elect people who support the Constitution, who will fulfill their oath and their duties to support the Constitution, as it's written, not as some judge has decided they want it to work. But it starts with us. It starts with freeing ourselves from dependence on government, on political parties, on candidates. Stop being dependent on others. Let's learn to stand for ourselves. Live at liberty without unnecessary external influence. Use that independence for good to help others learn how to live free, even if we disagree with how they go about doing it. And if you do that, well, then Washington becomes more background noise than anything else. Now, I'm still going around the country for my Blessings of Liberty tour. Please check it out. Go to constitutionstudy.com/tour. I'm still on the radio. I'm on America Out Loud Talk Radio 5 days a week, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Find out more at americaoutloud.com. I'm still doing the online Constitution study. Again, constitutionstudy.com/study. All of these are resources that you can use to help educate yourself, educate your family, and educate your neighbor. If you can help me in that work, I'd appreciate it. You can start by sharing these messages, sharing the articles, sharing the fact that I'm on the radio, and still on a little bit of social media. Now, if you can support me financially, there's a donate page on the Constitution Study website. If you'd like me to come speak at one of your events or to one of your groups, well, you can find out more on the website, especially on the tour page. These are all resources that we can use. And it's ways you can help me get this message out to more and more people. Because it's up to us in our counties and our local governments to regain control of them, to make a long-lasting change. You may kick one party out of office or another party out of office, but the change won't happen until we, the people, become free citizens and live at liberty. And if that's a message you think is worth sharing, please do so everywhere you can, and find others that you can bring here the next time for the Constitution study.
There's one thing you have to know wherever you make your stand. Came from